In Louisiana during early 1945, the train slowed beneath humid skies, as German women pressed faces to slatted wood, expecting chains and screams, yet encountering silence and ordered platforms. A moment stretching unbearably while beliefs hardened by years of propaganda began to fracture. They had traveled from shattered Europe, packed into boxcars with fear, rehearsing warnings of savagery, humiliation, and racial terror, taught relentlessly by the Reich, convinced America's vengeance awaited them, as wheels ground forward and the air thickened like judgment itself looming. As the train crawled toward the platform, no shouts erupted, no blows fell, only measured movement appeared. And the women sensed an unsettling calm, because anticipation built on terror requires noise, while silence invites doubt to seep inward and rearrange certainty and time here. Through narrow slats the station emerged, ordinary and sunlit, guarded by soldiers standing evenly spaced, their posture controlled, rifles relaxed, uniforms pressed, presenting an image so incompatible with expectation that breathing paused as minds searched desperately for hidden menace everywhere nearby. These women had been told black soldiers embodied chaos, brutality, and degeneration, yet before them stood disciplined ranks, faces unreadable beneath southern heat, challenging lessons learned in classrooms and cinemas, where lies had been repeated until they felt immovable forever there. Time elongated as the train halted fully, metal groaning softly, while guards signaled with calm efficiency, and the women realized terror had promised spectacle, but reality offered procedure, order, and an unfamiliar dignity that unsettled them more deeply than cruelty. In that suspended moment, memories of posters and lectures collided with living evidence, producing confusion rather than relief. Because if the first image was false, then everything built upon it, including fear itself, might also be untrue in time here. The air pressed heavy and wet, unlike Europe, carrying unfamiliar scents of water and vegetation, while palm silhouettes edged the horizon, signaling entry into a world where geography itself felt alien, amplifying vulnerability and sharpening every observation the women made. No one spoke as doors opened, because language seemed dangerous, and each woman watched the soldiers' hands closely, expecting sudden violence, yet seeing only restraint, a contradiction so stark it forced internal recalibration without warning or permission at that instant. This first encounter did not offer comfort. Instead, it dismantled certainty because fear relies on predictability, and what stood before them was unpredictable professionalism, quietly undermining narratives designed to simplify enemies into monsters beyond empathy or understanding forever there alone. As guards directed movement with gestures rather than threats, the women sensed rules would govern this captivity, not whim, a realization simultaneously relieving and destabilizing, because systems can be judged, whereas cruelty without order destroys hope entirely for the mind. When the train finally stilled completely, something irreversible occurred within them, as doctrine loosened its grip, replaced by observation, and the understanding dawned that survival would now depend on seeing clearly, rather than believing blindly, for the first time ever. 3 weeks earlier near Cherbourg, German women stood within a makeshift enclosure, watching Allied columns advance as occupation collapsed around them, uncertainty replacing routine, and capture arrived not with gunfire but with lists, guards, and clipped multilingual commands issued calmly by officers nearby. Among them was Greta Hoffmann, a 32-year-old nurse who had treated wounded Wehrmacht soldiers across Poland and Normandy, believing service granted protection, yet now she stood catalogued, searched, and numbered, as the Reich's authority evaporated under gray coastal skies. Teachers, factory workers, telephone operators, musicians, all gathered together, represented ordinary lives abruptly interrupted, as Allied momentum swept France, collapsing bureaucracies faster than identities could adjust, leaving women defined suddenly by armbands, categories, and enemy status without trial or ceremony. Red Cross armbands still clung to sleeves, stained with dust and rain, symbols of care rendered meaningless by defeat. As medical neutrality dissolved, and former healers were reclassified, processed, and redirected by victorious systems moving relentlessly forward across the coast. Guards were firm but procedural, issuing instructions in several languages, allowing belongings, recording names, ages, professions, and hometowns, transforming individuals into data points, a transition chilling precisely because it lacked overt violence or rage during surrender processing under Allied authority. Rumors spread constantly inside the enclosure, executions whispered, deportations imagined, revenge anticipated, because uncertainty breeds imagination, and imagination fed by propaganda always turns dark, especially when fate rests entirely in unseen foreign hands after years of indoctrination within Germany itself. Despite fear, no beatings occurred, no summary punishments followed, only waiting, hours stretching into days, as paperwork determined destinies, reinforcing a strange dissonance, where captivity felt administrative, not immediately brutal, confounding expectations built over years of war and collapse everywhere. Transport orders finally arrived, moving selected women toward ports, without explanation, feeding dread through silence because clarity can comfort, while ambiguity sharpens fear, and the destination America sounded mythic and terrifying in equal measure to them after long uncertainty there. Personal items were confiscated selectively, diaries hidden, photographs concealed, symbols of identity preserved secretly, because memory felt like resistance and many women clung to proof of former lives while stepping into undefined captivity beyond Europe, and certainty itself vanished completely. The march from holding camp to transport trucks felt ceremonial in its orderliness, watched by civilians and soldiers alike, signaling that this transition belonged to systems not passions, a realization that unsettled those prepared for chaos instead of violence alone. Night fell over Cherbourg with little drama, lights dimmed, guards rotated, and women slept fitfully, realizing the old world had ended quietly, not with explosions, but with signatures, stamps, and directions spoken calmly by strangers from victorious armies now present. By morning departure was inevitable, and Cherbourg receded into memory, as women boarded vehicles toward ships waiting offshore, carrying fear, confusion, and unanswered questions, unaware this journey would dismantle beliefs far deeper than captivity itself ever had since childhood indoctrination. From childhood, the Reich taught rigid myths, depicting America as decadent and racially chaotic, lessons delivered through classrooms, posters, newsreels, and sermons, repeating claims that democracy bred weakness and violence, until fear felt factual and alternative images became unimaginable to obedient audiences everywhere. Race occupied central place in this instruction, where Black Americans were caricatured as savages, criminals, and threats, shown in films, posters, and lectures, asserting that American armies unleashed brutality, using dehumanization to bind loyalty and justify coming war against imagined barbarism. Women absorbed these messages daily, through radio programs, youth organizations, and compulsory screenings, learning to associate dark skin with danger and humiliation, believing captivity under Americans meant assault and degradation, especially for women linked to service for the Reich itself. Contradiction was erased deliberately, because colonial history's scientific racism and selective storytelling framed Black soldiers as proof of democratic failure, while ignoring American segregation complexities, ensuring audiences never encountered nuance, only simplified horror designed to mobilize fear, obedience, and hatred efficiently. For nurses like Greta, training reinforced these views, warning that enemy captors would exploit vulnerability, spreading disease, humiliation, and sexual violence. Narratives repeated so often they became reflexive truths, shaping expectations long before any American face was ever seen there. Fear proved useful because it disciplined populations and excused brutality elsewhere, presenting war as defensive necessity against monstrous others, and discouraging empathy that might weaken resolve, making surrender unthinkable and captivity synonymous with moral annihilation in collective imagination everywhere today. This propaganda left little room for doubt because dissent risked punishment and social isolation, so even private skepticism remained dangerous, allowing myths to calcify across years, embedding fear deeply into identity, memory, and expectation carried into defeat and capture abroad. By 1945, these teachings persisted, despite evidence collapsing elsewhere, because ideology outlasts circumstances, and when women boarded ships westward, fear traveled with them, rehearsed endlessly during sleepless nights as protective armor against imagined atrocities taught, learned, repeated daily. The power of these lessons lay in repetition, saturating every medium until contradiction seemed impossible. So encountering disciplined Black soldiers later produced shock, not relief, because minds trained for horror struggled to accept calm professionalism without suspicion or trust quickly. Thus propaganda functioned as invisible guard, shaping reactions before contact occurred, ensuring fear preceded sight, and that first encounters would test not only captors, but the fragile architecture of belief constructed over years of instruction and silence everywhere continually deeply. When reality failed to match expectation, psychological strain intensified, because surrendering fear meant admitting deception, a painful reckoning for those whose lives were organized around obedience. Certainty and loyalty cultivated by the state over decades through schools' media rituals nationwide deeply. This education ensured captivity began long before trains and ships, because fear arrived first, installed carefully by words, images, and warnings, setting the stage for a confrontation between belief and lived experience that would redefine understanding forever for them all. The ship waited offshore, steel hulks rising from gray water as German women were herded aboard under watchful eyes, believing this crossing marked a descent into cruelty, because oceans symbolized distance from law, mercy, and familiar restraint taught by propaganda, and fear intensified with every wave. Below deck's darkness swallowed them, hammocks stacked tight, air thick with fuel, sweat, and sickness as engines vibrated constantly, reinforcing belief punishment had begun because discomfort felt intentional. Every lurch interpreted as cruelty, rehearsed by imagined American captors awaiting opportunities. Seasickness spread quickly, women retching into buckets, clinging to bunks, whispering prayers learned in childhood as steel walls groaned endlessly, and time dissolved into nausea, fear, and exhaustion, reinforcing expectation that suffering preceded worse horrors promised by years of indoctrination. No explanations were offered, orders minimal and procedural, guards distant but present, which confused prisoners accustomed to theatrical brutality narratives, because silence allowed imagination to dominate. And imagination trained by propaganda always conjured humiliation, torture, and abuse beyond endurance. Food arrived regularly, though unremarkable watery soup, bread portions measured, sustaining life but not comfort. And this neutrality unsettled expectations because kindness seemed suspicious, interpreted as preparation before punishment rather than genuine adherence to rules governing prisoners of war. Women marked days by ship noises, by meals, by sickness cycles, losing sense of geography, as Atlantic crossings stretched endlessly, reinforcing helplessness because distance from Europe felt irreversible. A symbolic crossing into a moral wilderness, imagined by Nazi instruction repeatedly. Greta wrote secretly, hiding scraps of paper, recording fears rather than facts, because documenting terror felt necessary, a shield against madness, writing that America awaited them like a verdict, where mercy would be absent and degradation inevitable as final retribution. Night intensified anxiety, darkness broken only by dim lights, waves pounding hulls like accusations, as women whispered stories of camp's violence and shame, reinforcing each other's dread, because collective fear thrives when unchecked by evidence or contradiction in confined spaces. Occasionally sailors passed silently, uninterested in prisoners, performing duties mechanically, which paradoxically deepened fear, because indifference seemed more frightening than anger, suggesting women mattered so little their suffering warranted no emotion or reaction at all. Storms battered the ship, amplifying misery, as bunks swayed violently, and some women cried openly, believing nature itself conspired to punish them, interpreting every hardship as confirmation that captivity under Americans would be merciless and relentless without boundaries. Yet nothing overt occurred. No beatings, no screams, no violations, only monotony, sickness, and waiting, creating cognitive strain, because expectation of cruelty clashed with procedural routine, forcing prisoners to endure uncertainty sharper than pain itself during endless days. By journey's end, fear had fermented deeply, shaped by weeks of anticipation, so when land finally appeared, women were primed for terror, convinced punishment awaited immediately. Unaware reality would instead dismantle fear through contradiction rather than violence entirely. The gangplank lowered slowly, humid air rushed aboard, and German women squinted toward docks shimmering beneath unfamiliar southern light of America there. What confronted them froze breath instantly, because rows of black American soldiers stood composed, disciplined, contradicting every image drilled into memory before. Uniforms were pressed despite heat. Rifles rested casually and faces remained impassive, projecting authority without menace along the busy waterfront of New Orleans. The women searched for cruelty signs, yet gestures were controlled, professional, dismantling rehearsed terror with silence rather than shouted threats, imagined propaganda. Nazi imagery collapsed inward, as living evidence replaced grotesque caricatures, forcing minds to reconcile doctrine with disciplined reality before their eyes now. Every still posture felt accusatory, because calm professionalism exposed lies more sharply than violence ever could have done to them before now. Some women expected sudden blows, yet soldiers neither leered nor spoke, maintaining distance consistent with regulation and respect observed under watchful officers. This restraint unsettled deeply, because fear had prepared them for savagery, not order practiced by men they were taught to despise blindly. A stumble occurred on the gangplank, and a black soldier steadied an older woman gently, eyes lowered respectfully without hesitation or display. Witnessing kindness cracked certainty because propaganda never explained compassion delivered by supposed monsters in moments of power and control over captives' lives. Heat pressed down mercilessly, sweat darkened uniforms, yet formation held, embodying discipline born from training, not cruelty demanded by duty and law. For prisoners, this composure felt unreal, like theater contradicting scripts memorized since childhood through schools' posters, newsreels, speeches, rallies, and whispers everywhere. The dock hummed with routine commerce. Cranes creaked nearby, and life continued indifferent to their dread as ships unloaded cargo behind them. Normalcy amplified shock, because terror thrives on spectacle, and here there was none to validate years of fearful instruction and warning tales. Some guards exchanged brief smiles among themselves, relaxed yet alert, embodying confidence absent of malice while overseeing transfer procedures calmly that day. These expressions confused prisoners because hatred was expected, not ordinary human affect displayed during custody by armed men trained for war service. Whispers rippled through the line, questions forming without answers, as belief systems strained audibly against the evidence standing before them on docks. Fear shifted shape quietly, because certainty dissolved into bewilderment that offered no guidance for survival under rules they no longer understood clearly. Orders were given efficiently, movements coordinated, and prisoners directed toward transport without insult or haste, amid clanging chains and dockside noise nearby. Procedure replaced spectacle, undermining fantasies of abuse cultivated by state narratives that demanded enemies be monstrous to justify endless sacrifice and obedience. As trucks waited open-sided, women stared back repeatedly, trying to memorize faces that disproved lies preached relentlessly throughout their former lives. No one cheered, mocked, or threatened, and restraint became the loudest statement delivered without words by uniformed men on American soil that day. This first sight lingered powerfully, marking a fracture point in belief impossible to repair through denial, habit, fear, or obedience again fully. What awaited inland remained unknown, but certainty had already died on the docks beneath the gaze of disciplined Black American soldiers there. The trucks rolled northward slowly, engines droning beneath oppressive Louisiana heat, wind carrying swamp scents through open sides. Silence dominated, broken only by rattling metal and distant insects, as German women watched unfamiliar landscapes pass, trying to interpret behavior from guards who neither threatened nor reassured. Humidity pressed like weight upon lungs, sweat soaked borrowed dresses, and nausea lingered from the crossing still. The black soldiers driving spoke rarely, eyes forward, hands steady on wheels, their quiet professionalism unsettling prisoners who expected taunts, cruelty, or triumphal gloating. Roads stretched endlessly through flat country, bayous flashing rust-colored water, trees draped with ghostly moss. This alien geography heightened disorientation, because nothing resembled Europe, and captivity unfolded within a landscape refusing familiar reference or emotional anchoring for the women. Questions circulated in whispers, asking destinations, intentions, fates, yet no answers came from drivers maintaining silence. Their restraint confused deeply because cruelty would have been understandable, while kindness without explanation felt destabilizing and harder to endure psychologically for the prisoners. At intervals, the convoy halted beneath shade, engines idling while guards passed water canteens back. Such pauses contradicted expectations, because concern for prisoner health seemed incompatible with stories of sadism taught relentlessly throughout wartime Germany by state propaganda for years. When one woman nearly fainted, a driver stopped immediately, signaling shade and patience without raised voice. This intervention shattered assumptions because mercy appeared routine, not exceptional, practiced calmly by men entrusted with absolute power over captives during wartime custody situations. Silence inside trucks felt heavy yet safe, lacking insults that might confirm fear. Women studied uniforms, posture, gestures, cataloging details desperately, as though understanding these men could restore logic to a collapsing worldview shaped by propaganda alone for years past. Occasionally soldiers spoke quietly among themselves, laughter brief and human, never directed toward prisoners. Hearing ordinary voices dismantled imagined monsters, replacing them with men enduring heat, duty, and boredom along endless roads during a protracted wartime transfer through unfamiliar states. The landscape rolled past relentlessly, farms, wetlands, shacks, and distant towns blurring together. Normal American life continued nearby, indifferent to captivity, intensifying confusion because war seemed strangely absent from this moving corridor of guarded transport, northward through peaceful countryside scenes. Fear did not vanish, yet transformed quietly, shifting from terror toward uneasy curiosity. Acts of restraint accumulated, eroding certainty incrementally, because every mile north contradicted indoctrination more effectively than argument ever could. Within their guarded journey across American territory now, women clutched small belongings, diaries, photographs, measuring time by road vibrations and stops. Greta wrote secretly, recording gestures that defied fear. Convinced memory itself required preservation amid disbelief, forming steadily under armed supervision during transport through humid southern regions today. By dusk the convoy continued onward, heat easing slightly, uncertainty deepening further. No blows fell, no screams followed, and silence itself became evidence, teaching captives that something fundamental about enemies had been profoundly misrepresented by years of propaganda and fear. The camp emerged from pine woods quietly. Rows of white barracks aligned with deliberate spacing that suggested administration rather than improvisation. Wire fences encircled the grounds evenly, lacking menace yet signaling authority, while guard towers stood staffed by men reading newspapers casually inside. Women disembarked under supervision calmly, expecting brutality but encountering procedure, names recorded methodically as if processing ordinary arrivals within a regulated system. This normality unsettled them deeply, because terror had prepared them for chaos, not clipboards, schedules, and predictable instructions issued daily by authority. The greatest shock arrived with command authority, embodied by a black American officer whose presence contradicted every racial hierarchy taught relentlessly before. He stood composed and formal, uniform immaculate despite heat, speaking through translators with confidence that allowed no doubt about his authority there. His announcement referenced Geneva protections explicitly, outlining work, pay, food, and safety, delivered without emotion or threat to assembled prisoners standing silently. The words sounded implausible to listeners, because kindness suggested deception, yet nothing in his tone hinted performance or mockery at that moment. Barracks interiors reinforced disbelief, containing bunks, lockers, fans, and screened windows, arranged with practical cleanliness that contrasted sharply with expected neglect. Everywhere. No chains hung from walls, no filth-coated floors, and inspections resembled civilian dormitories rather than punitive detention within a wartime camp. Rules were explained clearly each morning, emphasizing order, punctuality, and mutual compliance, enforced without shouting or humiliation by designated guards on duty. Punishment existed but followed procedure. Confinement or labor adjustments applied consistently, reducing fear through predictability rather than impulsive violence commonly expected previously. Guards rotated professionally, many black soldiers performing duties with restraint, never exploiting power for personal gratification despite absolute control over captives daily. Their conduct forced reassessment quietly, because authority exercised without cruelty dismantled ideological certainty faster than debate ever could. Under such conditions present, work details began promptly, kitchens, laundry, and maintenance staffed by prisoners under supervision focused on efficiency instead of intimidation. During long days, hours remained limited, breaks enforced for heat, and water distributed generously, contradicting expectations of exhaustion or deliberate deprivation previously assumed inevitable here. Evenings revealed unexpected normalcy. Guards played baseball nearby, laughter drifting across fences into listening barracks without hostility, mockery, or provocation toward prisoners. Music sometimes carried from radios, American melodies softening edges of captivity, introducing cultural dissonance instead of fear within the guarded compound nightly. The black commanding officer remained distant yet visible, inspecting facilities regularly, setting tone through presence rather than theatrics or intimidation tactics alone. For prisoners conditioned to racial absolutism, his authority represented a conceptual earthquake, destabilizing beliefs foundational to identity within their worldview long enforced. Whispers circulated nightly, debating whether benevolence masked delayed cruelty, skepticism persisting despite accumulating evidence observed daily across routines, rules, and interactions witnessed. No reversal arrived suddenly. Only continuity, which paradoxically proved more unsettling than abuse, would have been for minds prepared for violence alone. Authority here appeared impersonal yet fair, systems replacing sadism, challenging assumptions about power under wartime custody by an unexpected administration structure entirely. Within days, fear transformed into vigilance, because kindness demanded interpretation, forcing prisoners to rethink enemies fundamentally and themselves under unprecedented circumstances there. The morning sun climbed slowly, casting long shadows across the campyard, and German women assembled reluctantly for roll call, expecting ritualized humiliation, yet finding measured organization and precise counting by guards who treated their duties with calm professionalism instead of rage or cruelty. They were guided toward the mess hall, uncertain, minds braced for starvation rations, watery soups, stale bread, imagining punishment in every measured step along the wooden walkways, where heat clung to skin and fear seemed inseparable from movement within a foreign, unfamiliar environment. The doors opened, and trays lined with scrambled eggs. Crisp bacon, hot coffee with cream, and fresh toast greeted their eyes, defying every expectation cultivated by propaganda, repetition, and terror, forcing disbelief that sustenance could exist under captivity without intent to harm anyone present there. Greta froze, clutching her plate, unsure whether touching the food would summon disaster, because indoctrinated fear expected punishment immediately following mercy. A ritualized sequence rehearsed endlessly in schools' propaganda films, and whispered warnings throughout her life under the Reich's authority system previously. Around her, other women hesitated, staring, afraid to eat, some brushing tears across dirt-streaked faces, unable to process that nourishment could arrive without malice or hidden threat from armed soldiers, nearby observing silently, yet without hostility. One black soldier noticed hesitation, mimed eating gestures gently, smiled briefly, and moved on to the next prisoner, a universal signal that broke fear without a word, showing a small, deliberate humanity entirely incompatible with the monstrous caricatures drilled into memory over years. Women began eating tentatively, some slowly, savoring warmth and flavor, while others consumed food ravenously after months of near starvation, creating a delicate balance between physical need and psychological processing of trust in the midst of a world that had taught only cruelty. The aroma of bacon and eggs filled the hall, contrasting sharply with memories of bread, sawdust, or meager rations at home in Germany, causing confusion and faint relief simultaneously as taste became evidence that authority could exist without violence in this strange new environment. The act of eating transformed into a small ceremony, a conscious reconciliation between body and mind, because consuming food that nurtured rather than punished contradicted everything previously learned about power, captivity, and expectation in an ideological framework that demanded fear at every step. Conversation remained muted, whispers traversing rows as women glanced at each other and guards, attempting to process that order, sustenance, and routine could coexist with captivity, teaching a lesson far more destabilizing than fear. The world they believed immutable could be wrong entirely. By the time trays were emptied, a subtle shift had occurred, where disbelief replaced terror momentarily, creating cognitive space for understanding that kindness, routine, and discipline could define imprisonment instead of cruelty, challenging foundational beliefs embedded since childhood and reinforced for decades. The morning ended quietly, with women lingering near tables, processing gratitude alongside confusion, their minds oscillating between disbelief and cautious hope, because the collapse of old beliefs was slow, cumulative, and grounded in ordinary acts performed by disciplined, humane individuals in positions of authority unexpectedly. Morning routines settled into rhythm quickly, roll call conducted with precision while mist lingered above sandy ground and insects hummed relentlessly. Guards counted silently, clipboards moving steadily, then dismissed the women toward assigned duties without insults, threats, or unnecessary displays of dominance. Work details defined each day, laundry steaming under tin roofs, kitchens echoing with clatter, maintenance crews repairing fences and pathways patiently. Labor proved tiring yet bounded. 8 hours enforced strictly, breaks honored, and supervisors corrected errors calmly rather than with punitive spectacle. Music became an unexpected companion, radios crackling softly from guard areas and sometimes barracks, filling air with swing melodies unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. Songs about distant cities and romance floated through pine trees, unsettling prisoners who associated music with home rather than confinement and enemy territory. Guards sang while working occasionally, harmonies emerging naturally, voices confident and unafraid, transforming routine labor into something almost communal in tone. This casual humanity disrupted psychological distance, making hostility difficult to maintain when oppressors appeared ordinary, even joyful, within oppressive circumstances. Evenings brought baseball games beyond the fence, bats cracking sharply, laughter carrying across compound boundaries, drawing silent audiences from barrack windows. Prisoners watched attentively, absorbing gestures, rules, teamwork, and sportsmanship that contradicted caricatures ingrained by years of propaganda training relentlessly. Small kindnesses accumulated quietly, a canteen passed back during heat, a pause allowed for dizziness, a blanket adjusted during cooler nights. None were dramatic, yet their consistency eroded certainty because cruelty would have been simpler to categorize and emotionally resist. Conversations remained limited by language, but gestures bridged gaps effectively. Nods, smiles, and shared routines creating fragile understanding. The guards neither mocked accents nor demanded gratitude, behaving as professionals fulfilling duties rather than avengers of ideological conflict. Confusion grew heavier than fear, as prisoners struggled to reconcile benevolence with captivity, kindness with authority, and equality with long-taught hierarchies. Each day challenged assumptions incrementally, forcing reflection during quiet hours previously occupied by terror and anticipation of suffering. Some women resisted internally, clinging to propaganda explanations, labeling behavior deceptive, temporary, or strategically manipulative by unseen American intent. Others began doubting doctrines entirely, recognizing that lived experience contradicted absolute narratives delivered relentlessly throughout their earlier lives. Letters home were permitted eventually, censored yet allowed. Another shock undermining expectations of isolation and silence. Writing forced articulation of uncertainty, describing treatment difficult without sounding disloyal to beliefs still emotionally ingrained deeply within them. Meals remained generous and regular, reinforcing stability, while shared tables fostered subdued conversations among prisoners, processing daily contradictions. Food ceased being merely sustenance, becoming symbolic proof that suffering was not inevitable, unsettling moral frameworks built around deserved punishment. Night brought reflection rather than dread, fans humming, distant music lingering, thoughts spiraling quietly toward uncomfortable questions. If enemies behaved humanely, then certainty about righteousness faltered, leaving confusion as the most persistent companion under guarded American skies. When certainty collapsed, memory began rearranging itself, forcing the women to confront lessons absorbed uncritically during formative years abroad there. What remained was not guilt alone, but awakening, a slow recognition that truth had been narrower than experience itself previously. They stored these contradictions quietly, knowing return would demand silence, because home expected familiar stories preserving ideological comfort and stability. Memory became a private archive, guarded carefully, shaping later reflections without language adequate for public confession amid post-war social rebuilding. Awakening did not arrive dramatically, instead it accumulated through routines, gestures, and moments defying expectations repeatedly within captivity, their daily. Each recollection carried sensory weight. Heat, music, food, voices, embedding doubt alongside gratitude and unresolved dissonance within memory, enduring permanently. Years later, telling these stories risked disbelief, because narratives contradicted wartime teachings still defended by many communities, institutions, families, fiercely. Silence therefore persisted, not from fear alone, but from uncertainty about how truth might wound listeners deeply, emotionally, socially, enduringly. Returning home meant rebuilding lives upon foundations subtly shifted, where certainty once provided uncomplicated moral clarity for everyone involved previously. Some carried gratitude quietly, others carried shame. Many carried questions without safe spaces for articulation inside families, workplaces, towns, afterward. What endured most strongly was dissonance, the recognition that humanity appeared where doctrine promised monstrosity falsely, historically, violently, insistently, before. This realization resisted erasure, returning unexpectedly during newsreels, conversations, or encounters with difference abroad, later in life stages, repeatedly, again. For some, reconciliation began internally, separating individuals encountered from regimes that shaped catastrophic belief systems through propaganda. Violence, fear, obedience. This distinction allowed empathy without absolution. A careful balance maintained privately rather than proclaimed publicly amid post-war tensions, scrutiny, judgment. Memory of American captivity complicated victim narratives, introducing kindness into stories expected to contain only suffering within public discourse frameworks. This complexity proved unsettling, because it demanded nuance during periods favoring simplified moral accounting after total defeat, occupation, hunger, loss. What they carried home was not America itself, but an irreparable fracture in certainty shaped by encounters, memory, time, reflection. This fracture quietly influenced parenting, teaching, and remembrance, shaping how war was explained subsequently to children, students, communities, generations later. Some eventually spoke openly, contributing testimonies that challenged monolithic histories and expanded understanding within archives, interviews, memoirs, classrooms, museums. Later, their voices remained measured, avoiding sensationalism, emphasizing observation over judgment while preserving dignity, restraint, context, accuracy, empathy, humility, patience, care. Others remained silent, yet silence itself testified to upheaval too complex for narration shaped by fear. Loyalty, memory, contradiction, trauma. Both paths reflected awakening, evidence that worldviews once absolute had failed irrevocably under lived reality. Experience, exposure, humanity, time, history. In the end, what endured was responsibility, to remember accurately and resist simplified hatred whenever encountered. Taught, inherited, repeated, again. The train slowing in Louisiana became a lifelong marker, dividing belief from knowledge forever within memory, conscience, identity, understanding, humanity.